Welcome to this deep dive. We're tackling a topic today that's, well, it's historically crucial and, frankly, still feels unsettlingly relevant. We're plunging into the complex world of fascism, and we're guided by some really dense, insightful source material that lays out its origins, its core ideas, and even its internal tensions.
That's right. And our mission here really is to take this stack of notes and articles we've got and just, dig into it properly.
Yeah.
We want to pull out the most important bits, the history, the core philosophy, the different ways it showed up to help you get a clear understanding of what fascism is, where it came from, and why it's so important to grasp.
Without getting lost in all the academic jargon, hopefully.
Exactly. Trying to keep it clear, accessible, but still deep.
Think of this as us trying to cut through the noise using the source material as our guide to understand a really significant and, well, unfortunately persistent political phenomenon.
It's definitely persistent.
It's not just something tucked away in history books, is it? You hear echoes or maybe different versions of these ideas even today. So understanding its kind of DNA seems vital.
Absolutely vital. Recognizing the roots, the fundamental tenets. That's really the first step. It gives you a framework for seeing connections, maybe spotting patterns you might otherwise miss, both in the past and potentially now.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Let's start right at the beginning. Origins. Our source material makes a really key point straight away.
Yeah.
Fascism isn't like the other big isms we often talk about.
Right. Not like liberalism, conservatism, socialism.
Exactly. Those are largely, 19th century ideologies, born out of the revolutions, the industrial changes of that era.
That's a crucial distinction. Fascism is, well, it's fundamentally a child of the 20th century. It really burst onto the scene in that period between the wars after World War I.
And it wasn't just offering another political choice, was it?
No, not at all. It emerged as a very deliberate, very radical revolt against modernity itself. It was actively rejecting the core values that had come out of the Enlightenment.
Right. It looked at those big Enlightenment ideas, things like universal reason, the belief in progress, individual freedom, equality, and basically said, nope, we're going the other way.
Precisely. The source points to Italian fascist slogans like believe, obey, fight, or order, authority, justice. These were explicitly set up against the French Revolution's ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity. A very direct challenge.
Yeah.
And the Nazis were even more blunt about it. They famously declared 1789 is abolished.
Wow. Abolishing the French Revolution.
Yeah. A total rejection of that whole modern liberal political tradition. This wasn't just tinkering around the edges. The source says they were trying to fundamentally root out and destroy what they saw as conventional political thought.
And this radical break, it didn't just come out of nowhere, did it? It wasn't purely intellectual.
No, definitely not. Our source material is really clear that fascism was profoundly shaped by the sheer trauma of World War I and its chaotic aftermath.
The war itself and then the revolutions.
Yeah.
Exactly. The scale of the destruction, the collapse of old empires, the wave of revolutions, especially the Bolshevik one in Russia, that whole tumultuous environment, was the crucible, the melting pot where fascism was forged.
The source highlights its dramatic emergence in Italy and Germany specifically.
It does. Italy first. The Fascist Party formed in 1919, right after the war. Mussolini, its leader, rose incredibly quickly, prime minister by 1922, and by 1926, Italy was effectively a one-party state.
And the term itself, fascismo.
Yeah, it came from Mussolini's paramilitary squads. He named them after the fasces, that ancient Roman symbol, the bundle of rods with an axe. It's all about unity, discipline, authority.
Symbolism matters.
Hugely. Meanwhile, over in Germany, you had the Nazi Party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, also popping up in 1919.
And the source notes they kind of copied Mussolini's style.
They did, consciously, under Hitler, and their rise was just as rapid, maybe even more terrifyingly efficient. Hitler became chancellor in 1933, and within a single year, Germany was a dictatorship.
And it wasn't just Italy and Germany, was it? The source mentions democracy collapsing elsewhere, too.
Across much of Europe, yeah. Especially in Eastern Europe. Many of those new post-war democracies just crumbled or were overthrown, often replaced by authoritarian regimes, some openly leaning towards fascism.
So the big question is, why then? Why did this radical rejection of established ideas find such fertile ground right at that moment?
Well, the source points to a whole complex mix of historical forces hitting at the same time. One really big one was just the weakness of democratic institutions themselves in many countries.
They were too new. Too fragile.
Often, yes. Many were brand new, set up after empires collapsed. They didn't have deep roots. And when crises hit, economic chaos, political instability, they just look weak, indecisive, unstable.
And in that situation, the idea of a strong leader, someone decisive.
Exactly. The appeal of strong personal rule becomes incredibly powerful when democracy seems to be failing, when things feel chaotic and out of control.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
What else?
Then there was the massive disruption caused by industrialization. This had been going on for a while, but its effects were really being felt. The source highlights how it particularly squeezed the lower middle class.
Who are we talking about here? Shopkeepers, farmers?
Yeah, exactly. Shopkeepers, small business owners, independent farmers, artisans, craftsmen, they felt trapped, caught between the growing power of big corporations and banks on one side, and the rise of organized labor, the trade unions, on the other.
Feeling squeezed from both ends.
Precisely. They felt their status, their livelihoods, their whole way of life was under threat. And fascism really tapped into that sense of grievance, that fear and resentment.
So fascism drew a lot of support from this group.
It really did. The source mentions it's sometimes called an extremism of the center, a revolt by these lower middle classes who felt threatened by both big capital and organized labor.
Which explains why it could be hostile to both capitalism and communism in its own way.
Exactly. It wasn't a simple left-right thing. It positioned itself as something different, something that understood their anxieties.
And you mentioned communism.
Yeah.
The fear of revolution must have been huge after Russia in 1917.
Massive. Absolutely massive. The source emphasizes this. Especially among the propertied classes, the business owners, the landowners, they were terrified that Bolshevism would spread, that they'd lose everything.
And they saw fascists as a way to stop that.
They often did. Many business interests, conservative elites, even if they found the fascists crude or distasteful, often through their support, financial and political, behind them, they saw them as the only force strong enough, ruthless enough, to crush the communist threat and keep the working class in line.
So from a Marxist view, fascism looks like the system protecting itself.
That's the argument the source mentions, yeah. That fascism is essentially a counter-revolution, the bourgeoisie using these movements to save capitalism from itself, or at least from socialist revolution.
Then layer on top of all that the Great Depression in the 1930s. The source calls this the final blow.
It really was devastating. Mass unemployment, businesses collapsing, banks failing. It created this overwhelming sense of crisis, despair, hopelessness. People lost faith in existing governments, in democracy itself.
Fertile ground for extremists.
Incredibly fertile ground. People were desperate for answers, for radical solutions, and fascists were right there, offering simple answers, scapegoats blaming Jews, immigrants, communists, corrupt politicians, and promising decisive action.
And we can't forget the legacy of World War I itself, can we? The source mentions unresolved conflicts, bitterness.
Absolutely. The war left behind a huge amount of bitterness, frustrated nationalism, and in some countries, a real thirst for revenge or reclaiming lost territory. This was strongest in the nations that felt cheated or defeated, like Germany, obviously, but also Italy and Japan felt they hadn't gotten their fair share from the victory.
And the experience of the war itself must have changed people.
Profoundly. The source argues it brutalized society, normalized mass violence, and fostered a really militant, aggressive kind of nationalism. The idea of using force to solve problems seemed, well, almost natural after 4 years of total war. Militaristic values, discipline, obedience, sacrifice were deeply ingrained.
It's a grim picture. Thankfully, these regimes were eventually defeated. But the source makes an important point about how they were defeated.
Yes, crucially, they were overthrown primarily by military defeat in World War II, not by internal popular uprisings, at least not while they were at the height of their power.
That feels significant.
It really is. Their end came largely from outside pressure, not from their own populations rejecting them wholesale. And since 1945, overt fascist movements have mostly been pretty marginal, which led some historians, like Ernst Nuttall mentioned in the source, to see fascism as a very specific interwar thing, tied to that unique historical moment.
But there's another view, isn't there? The source introduces this idea that maybe it's not just historical conditions.
Right. The counter-argument, also noted in the source, is that fascism represents an ever-present danger. And this view links its potential appeal not just to external crises, but to something deeper, something about human psychology.
The fear of freedom.
Exactly. Erich Fromm's concept. The idea is that modern life, while giving us more freedom, can also make us feel isolated, insecure, powerless. And in times of really deep crisis, that freedom can feel like a burden.
So people might actually want to escape it.
That's the theory, that some individuals might seek security and belonging by surrendering their autonomy, by submitting to an all-powerful leader or state. It's a flight from freedom into certainty and perceived strength. And if that psychological vulnerability exists,
Then the potential for fascism, or something like it, persists, ready to be activated in the next crisis.
that's the unsettling implication. It suggests it's not just about historical conditions repeating, but about tapping into a recurring human vulnerability.
And the source mentions this became a concern after communism collapsed in Eastern Europe.
Yes, 1989 to 91. There were real fears then about neo-Fascism emerging as old national rivalries and ethnic hatreds suppressed for decades came bubbling back to the surface in that power vacuum.
Okay, so we'll come back to the question of fascism today later on. But first, let's try and pin down what it actually is. The source seems to suggest this is harder than it looks.
It really is. There's a genuine debate about whether fascism even counts as a coherent ideology in the same way we think of, say, liberalism or socialism.
The source quotes Trevor Roper calling it an ill-assorted hodgepodge.
Yeah, not exactly a ringing endorsement of its intellectual coherence. And even Hitler apparently preferred the term Weltanschauung, a worldview.
What's the difference?
Well, a worldview demands commitment, faith, maybe even emotional fervor, rather than appealing to systematic, logical argument like a traditional ideology might claim to. It suggests the appeal is more emotional, more about mobilization than rational persuasion.
So fascists weren't interested in reasoned debate.
Not really. They were drawn to ideas that could stir people up, get them acting. The source suggests maybe it's better to think of it as a political movement fueled by myth and willpower, or even like a kind of political religion demanding absolute faith.
Which makes it hard to define a neat set of core beliefs, a fascist minimum.
Exactly. And the historical examples themselves are messy. Is Franco's Spain fascist in the same way as Nazi Germany? What about Imperial Japan? How do modern far-right groups fit in? Are they neo-fascist, post-fascist? The labels themselves are loaded and contested.
The source mentions scholars have tried single-sentence definitions. Nolte's resistance to transcendence, Griffin's palingenetic ultranationalism.
That last one, palingenetic ultranationalism, is pretty influential. Palingenesis means rebirth. So the idea of national rebirth fused with extreme nationalism. We'll definitely come back to that. But the point is, no single neat formula seems to capture it all.
Okay, so if a single definition is tricky, the source suggests looking for a collection of recurring themes instead.
Yes, key themes that tend to appear together and form its core. The source lists 5. Anti-rationalism, struggle, leadership, and elitism, a specific take on socialism, and ultranationalism.
Let's start with anti-rationalism. This sounds fundamental.
It absolutely is. It's presented as a direct revolt against the whole Enlightenment project.
Against reason, progress, individual rights.
All of it. The Enlightenment championed universal reason as the path to liberation. But by the late 19th century, you had thinkers starting to question reason supremacy, pointing to other drives, well, instinct, emotion.
Like Nietzsche.
Nietzsche is a key figure mentioned, yeah.
Oh.
His will to power. Also Sorel on political myths that motivate action through emotion, not logic. And Bergson's vitalism emphasizing instinct and life force over intellect.
And fascism grabbed these ideas and ran with them.
It took these counter-Enlightenment strands and gave them a radical, extreme political expression. And this anti-rationalism shows up in several key ways in fascism.
How so?
First, just a deep anti-intellectualism. Fascism generally despised abstract thought, theorizing. It revered action. Mussolini slogans again, action not talk, inactivity is death.
So ideas were just tools.
Pretty much. Tools to stir the soul, whip up emotions, trigger instincts. Leaders like Mussolini and Hitler were master propagandists, brilliant at using ideas for emotional impact to mobilize people. The source calls it a politics of the will.
Second.
Its negative, destructive character. It was often much clearer about what it was against than what it was for. The source calls it an anti-philosophy, anti-rational, anti-liberal, anti-conservative, anti-capitalist, anti-communist, a long list of anti.
It's nihilistic.
Some argue that, particularly about Nazism, a revolution of nihilism. But it wasn't just about tearing down, it was also about inverting Enlightenment values. Freedom becomes submission. Democracy becomes dictatorship. Progress becomes struggle and war. It's a deliberate reversal.
But they still saw themselves as creating something new.
Paradoxically, yes, a creative force, building a new civilization through destruction. There's this weird fusion of birth and death, creation and destruction at its heart.
And if you reject universal reason, What do you put in its place?
Faith in things like history, culture, instinct, and crucially, the organic community. Society isn't seen as individuals making rational choices, but as this indivisible whole, bound by deep, emotional, almost tribal loyalties stemming from a shared past and identity.
Taking organic unity to the extreme.
Absolutely. The Volksgemeinschaft in Germany is everything. Individual desires, class differences, all must be subordinated to the collective will, the collective destiny. Strength through unity. That Nazi slogan sums it perfectly. Total moral and cultural fusion.
And the goal of all this revolution of the spirit.
To create the new man, the fascist man, a hero motivated purely by duty, honor, self-sacrifice, ready to dissolve their individuality completely into the collective.
Okay, so that's the anti-rational foundation. What about the next theme? Struggle.
This is where social Darwinism really comes into play. Darwin's ideas about natural selection had a huge impact on political thought in the late 19th century, especially during that period of intense nationalism and imperial rivalry leading up to World War I.
So fascists took the idea of survival of the fittest and applied it to nations and politics.
They did, wholeheartedly. Struggle wasn't seen as a problem. It was seen as the natural, inevitable, even desirable condition of life, both within society and between nations. Competition, conflict, these were the engines of progress, ensuring the strong thrive and the weak. Well, Hitler said it. Victory is to the strong, and the weak must go to the wall.
And the ultimate struggle is war.
For fascists, yes. War was the ultimate test, the highest expression of national vitality. The source points out fascism is almost unique in seeing war as intrinsically good. Remember Mussolini's line, "War is to men what maternity is to women." It's seen as necessary, purifying, character building.
That completely flips traditional morality, doesn't it?
Totally. Goodness becomes strength. Evil becomes weakness. Values like compassion, sympathy for the vulnerable, those are rejected. Instead, fascists revere martial values. Loyalty, duty, obedience, sacrifice.
Leading to a worship of power.
An outright worship of power and strength. Weakness isn't just pitied, it's despised. And the source makes the chilling point that eliminating the weak wasn't just accepted, it was sometimes actively welcomed, a necessary sacrifice for the health of the nation or race. Like pruning a tree.
And the source gives the example of eugenics.
The Nazi eugenics program is the most horrifying illustration. It started with forced sterilization of the disabled, then escalated to systematic murder, the T4 program. And crucially, the source notes the Holocaust, the attempt to exterminate European Jews, was viewed by the Nazi leadership within the same twisted logic as racial eugenics on a massive scale, eliminating a perceived biological threat.
This belief in unending struggle must have shaped their foreign policy, too.
Absolutely. It gave fascism its inherently restless, expansionist drive. National strength wasn't something you just had. It had to be constantly proven, demonstrated through conflict, conquest, victory.
Like Hitler's demand for Lebensraum.
Exactly. His call for living space in the East, outlined in Mein Kampf years before, aimed at achieving German domination, and his actions followed. Rearmament, annexing Austria, breaking up Czechoslovakia, invading Poland, invading the Soviet Union. It was relentless.
And even at the very end.
Even facing total defeat in 1945, the source notes, Hitler didn't ditch the social Darwinist worldview. He reportedly blamed the German nation for failing him, for proving unworthy in the struggle. He ordered a fight to the death, the destruction of Germany itself. It shows how absolute that belief in struggle was.
Okay, so struggle is the mechanism. What about the leadership? Theme 3.
Yeah.
Leadership and elitism. And this is a total rejection of equality.
Fundamentally, fascism is profoundly elitist and, historically at least, intensely patriarchal. It's built on the conviction that society is naturally hierarchical. Some people are just born leaders, born superiors.
And they prove it through struggle.
That's the idea. Leaders rise to the top because they are inherently stronger, more visionary, more ruthless. Society, in the fascist view, basically has 3 tiers.
Which are?
At the very top, the supreme, almost infallible leader whose authority is absolute. Below them, a warrior elite, heroic, visionary, self-sacrificing, almost always male. The SS in Germany is the archetype. And then everyone else.
The masses.
The masses. Viewed as basically weak, passive, ignorant, their role. Unquestioning obedience. Follow the leader, follow the elite.
That's a pretty bleak view of humanity.
It's incredibly pessimistic about ordinary people, yeah. a complete contrast to liberal democracy, which is founded on the idea that people are rational and capable of governing themselves.
Yeah.
Fascism says, no, they're not. They need to be told what to do.
And this supreme leader idea, it draws on Nietzsche's Übermensch.
The source suggests it does, yeah. The idea of the Superman who stands above the herd beyond conventional morality. Fascism took that philosophical concept and turned it into a very concrete political principle. The Führer principle, the leader principle.
So the leader isn't just a head of government.
No, they are the state, the embodiment of the nation's will. Mussolini was Il Duce, Hitler was der Führer, just the leader. It signals their authority comes from them, personally, not from any constitution or law.
Based on charisma.
Yes, their power stems from their personal charisma, their perceived unique gifts. Unlike legal authority, which has rules and limits, charismatic authority can be boundless. The leader's word is law because they are the law.
Hence those chilling slogans, Hitler is Germany, Mussolini is always right.
Exactly. The leader defines the real will of the people. Any institution that might get in the way, parliaments, courts, parties, is either abolished or hollowed out, made irrelevant. All power flows directly from the leader.
It sounds like absolute dictatorship, but the source uses the term totalitarian democracy.
It does, acknowledging it's a bit paradoxical. It fuses that idea of the all-powerful leader with a twisted version of the general will, claiming the leader somehow embodies what the people truly want, even if they don't realize it themselves.
And the leader's job is to awaken them to this destiny.
Yes, to transform the passive masses into this mobilized, powerful force. Which is why fascist regimes, unlike old-style dictatorships, put so much effort into propaganda, rallies, mass mobilization. They needed to constantly demonstrate this supposed unity and devotion to the leader.
Okay, moving on. Theme 4. The relationship with socialism. This one feels complicated.
It is definitely complicated and often confusing. Given their ferocious anti-communism, this socialist label seems odd.
Mussolini was a socialist originally, right? And Hitler's party had socialist and workers in its name.
Correct. And the source suggests this was partly cynical, a way to try and win over working-class voters from actual socialist and communist parties.
But was there anything more to it? Any genuine overlap?
The source points to a few limited areas. One was a real resentment among some grassroots fascists, especially the lower middle class ones, towards big business and finance.
The little guy getting squeezed again.
Exactly. The shopkeeper versus the department store, the small farmer versus the big landowner, the small business versus the banks. There was a genuine strain of anti-capitalist feeling there, especially early on in groups like the Nazi SA.
And like socialists, fascists believed in collectivism.
Yes, that's a key similarity. The community, nation, or race comes before the individual. The bourgeois capitalist focus on individual self-interest was seen as deeply damaging to national unity. Common good before private good was the Nazi slogan.
They also seemed to reject materialism.
Often, yes, at least rhetorically. The pursuit of wealth seemed petty compared to their grand visions of national regeneration, heroism, conquest.
And they did intervene in the economy, didn't they? It wasn't pure free market capitalism.
No, far from it. Fascist states heavily regulated and controlled capitalism, trying to force it to serve national goals. Oswald Mosley's quote captures it. Capitalism uses the nation. Fascism uses capital for the nation.
So state control, regulation.
Yes, both Italy and Germany increased state intervention massively. Goering's four-year plan in Germany, aimed at war preparation and self-sufficiency, was even explicitly modeled on Soviet five-year plans, ironically enough.
For our big butts here, right?
Huge ones. The source stresses the limitations. Those leftist, anti-capitalist elements within fascism, they were ruthlessly purged once power was secure.
Like the Night of the Long Knives in Germany.
The classic example. Hitler eliminated the SA leadership partly to reassure big business and the army. The Marxist view, noted in the source, is that fascism's real purpose was to save capitalism from revolution by crushing the workers' movement.
And their economic policies weren't that consistent anyway.
Often quite vague and pragmatic, driven by the immediate needs of the regime, rearmament, expansion, rather than a coherent economic ideology.
And most importantly,
their anti-communism was far, far stronger and more central than any anti-capitalism. A core goal was always to destroy Marxism, to win workers away from international solidarity and class struggle, and bind them instead to the nation or the race through loyalty and obedience. National unity trumped everything.
So the socialism was mostly branding, mixed with some convenient anti-big business sentiment.
That seems a fair summary based on the source material. It was secondary to nationalism, Which brings us to the final core theme, ultranationalism.
And this wasn't just patriotism, this was extreme.
Extremely extreme, chauvinistic, expansionist. It didn't see nations as equal members of a global community. It saw them as rivals in a brutal struggle for dominance. Your nation wasn't just good, it was inherently superior to all others.
And in Nazism, this became explicitly racial.
Yes, the idea of the Aryan master race. But even non-racial fascism was intensely nationalistic, fueled by that post-WWI bitterness and frustration.
The source mentions integral nationalism.
Yes, the idea that national identity should consume everything else. It aimed for this intense, militant, almost fanatical sense of belonging, promising national rebirth, regeneration, a return to glory after perceived humiliation. That promise of national greatness was a huge part of its appeal.
This links back to that palingenetic idea, rebirth.
Exactly. Griffin's theory. Fascism taps into a sense that society is decadent, broken. But it doesn't just complain, it offers this mythic vision of total renewal, the nation rising phoenix-like from the ashes.
How? By looking back and forward.
Kind of. It fuses idealized myths of a glorious past imperial Rome for Italy, earlier German empires for the Nazis, with this promise of a radically new future, embodied by the new man.
But this regeneration wasn't peaceful.
No, in practice, the source states it meant asserting power over other nations. Expansionism, war, conquest. Driven by social Darwinism and belief in superiority, it led directly to militarism and imperialism.
Lebensraum, African empires, co-prosperity spheres.
All examples of this drive. And linked to this was the goal of autarky.
Economic self-sufficiency.
Yes. The idea that true strength meant relying only on resources your nation controlled through its own territory or conquered lands. So conquest wasn't just for glory, it was seen as essential for economic security too. National regeneration, economic strength, military power, all tied together.
Okay, so those are the core themes. But the source also stresses fascism wasn't monolithic. There were tensions, especially between Italy and Germany.
Big tensions. The source highlights this contrast really clearly. Fundamentally, it was Italian fascism's extreme statism versus Nazi Germany's extreme racialism.
State versus race as the ultimate principle.
Exactly. Italy worshipped the all-powerful totalitarian state. For the Nazis, the state was just a tool, a vessel. The race, the Volk, was the real source of creative power.
And that led to other differences.
Many. Italian fascism was more about national greatness achieved through state power. Nazism was about biological superiority achieved through racial purity and eugenics. Italy's anti-Semitism was more pragmatic, political. Nazi anti-Semitism was core ideology leading to genocide.
Italy was also more open theoretically, wasn't it? Voluntaristic.
Right. In theory, anyone could become a loyal fascist subject by submitting to the state. Nazism was essentialist, your race, fixed at birth, determined your destiny. You couldn't become Aryan.
What about their view of modernity?
Another contrast. Italian fascism actually had links to futurism, saw the state as an agent of modernization, building an industrial society. Nazism, weirdly, had this strong anti-modern peasant ideology strand.
And economically, corporatism versus a war economy.
Broadly, yes. Italy experimented with corporatism as a third way. Nazi Germany quickly became geared entirely towards war and conquest. Even their expansionist goals differed. Italy sought a colonial empire. Germany aimed for total domination of Europe and potentially the world.
Let's pick up on that peasant ideology in Nazism. That seems quite counterintuitive for a regime that built V-2 rockets.
It's a fascinating contradiction, isn't it? The source explains that Nazism, at a philosophical level, really despised much of modern life cities, industry seeing them as decadent, corrupting influences.
They idealized the farmer.
Very much so. The ideal German was seen as a peasant, rooted in the soil, close to nature, ennobled by physical labor. City life weakened the spirit, threatened the racial stock.
The whole blood and soil thing.
Blut und Boden, exactly. Promoted by figures like Walter Dürre. It blended Nordic racial ideas with this romantic vision of rural life. They talked about authentic German culture versus shallow Western civilization.
And this influenced foreign policy.
It helped justify Lebensraum. Germany needed more land so its people could supposedly return to this healthy peasant existence, escaping overcrowded, decadent cities.
The reality.
The reality, as the source points out, was the complete opposite. To wage war and conquer that Lebensraum, they needed massive industrialization, cutting-edge technology. The Nazi era saw rapid growth of the very cities and industries their ideology condemned.
So the peasant stuff was just rhetoric.
Largely, yes. When push came to shove, the demands of war and empire dictated industrial expansion. Though Nazi art often showed those rural idols, their propaganda simultaneously glorified the Stuka, the Panzer, the rocket symbols of modern technological power. A real paradox.
Okay, so bringing all these threads together, the origins, the core ideas, the variations, the contradictions, we come back to that final question. Is fascism dead? Or is it still a threat in our global age?
The source presents both sides. Some argue, like Nolte, that it was fundamentally tied to that interwar revolt against modernization and died with Hitler in the bunker, Götterdämmerung.
What?
But the fact that movements drawing on fascist ideas keep popping up complicates that. It suggests that the underlying conditions or appeals might still resonate.
What conditions?
Crisis, uncertainty, disorder. The source suggests the relative stability after 1945 suppressed it. But economic instability, political disillusionment, fears about immigration and national identity, these create openings for extremism.
And globalization plays a role.
The source argues it does. The end of the Cold War let old hatreds resurface in places, and globalization itself can weaken the nation-state, undermine traditional identities, leading some towards more insular, ethnic, or racial forms of nationalism as a reaction.
Though the source also notes some differences today.
Crucial differences. We're post-colonial, not imperial. Multiculturalism makes ethnic purity goals unrealistic. Class structures are different, and economic globalization makes the old fascist dream of autarky through conquest seem pretty unworkable.
So modern movements are different, neo-fascist.
That's the term often used. While some fringe groups cling to old-school fascism, the bigger parties operate differently. They often accept electoral democracy, at least on the surface. They distance themselves from overt totalitarianism or the worst excesses of Hitler and Mussolini.
Democratic fascism.
It's a challenging term, but captures that idea of fascism stripped of some of its most obvious classical features, adapted to work within existing systems.
And this adapted form might be more viable today.
Potentially. By looking less like historical fascism, it might seem less threatening to some. But the source warns it can still tap into those core appeals, the promise of unity through exclusion, blaming scapegoats, rejecting complexity, especially if future crises related to global capitalism create instability and dislocation.
Wow, okay.
That
was a lot to unpack. We've journeyed through the origins of fascism, its roots in that post-WWI chaos, and its rejection of Enlightenment ideas.
Yeah.
We've looked at those core themes, anti-reason, struggle, leadership, that odd flirtation with socialism and extreme nationalism.
Leading right up to the horrifying reality of Nazi Germany, the Holocaust, and now this ongoing debate about whether fascism or something like it still poses a threat today, perhaps in a different guise.
Yeah, we've seen how it twisted ideas of unity, progress, and freedom into justifications for submission, violence, and exclusion, how it glorified struggle and elevated leaders above all else.
Understanding these elements, the rejection of reason for myth, the obsession with power and purity, the scapegoating, it's so crucial for seeing how these movements gain traction and the absolute devastation they caused.
This deep dive really highlights the historical forces, but also maybe those deeper psychological vulnerabilities that fascism exploits, and how similar pressures, economic fear, social change, identity anxiety, might play out differently now.
It leaves you thinking, doesn't it?
It really does. So for you listening, digesting all of this, what's the takeaway?
Well, maybe consider this. If fascism, as the source suggests, thrives in times of crisis, uncertainty, and perceived disorder, are there elements of that around us now? And if movements emerge that tap into those core fascist themes, maybe not using the label, maybe looking different on the surface, but still preaching absolute unity through excluding others, rejecting complex realities for simple myths, blaming scapegoats, calling for unquestioning loyalty to a strong leader.
Armed with what we've discussed, what signs might you look for? How might you recognize those patterns, even in new forms? Something definitely worth mulling over.